They refused her water, and by sundown, a man gave her something the whole town feared more than any weapon. Dignity traveled slow across the west, and that afternoon it stopped right in the middle of Dry Creek, where the dust hung thick enough to taste and the sun pressed down like a hand that never lifted. Nayeli stood alone near the well, her shadow long and thin against the wooden boards, while Boots shuffled around her but never too close. Voices low, eyes colder than the wind that sometimes came off the ridge. She asked for water once, just once, her voice steady, but the man holding the bucket tipped it sideways, letting it spill into the dirt as if the ground deserved it more than she did, and a few laughed, not loud, not brave, just enough to make sure she heard. She didn't flinch, not then, not when the last drop disappeared into the cracked earth, but something in her eyes dimmed. Like a fire choosing to burn lower instead of going out. That was when Ethan Cole stepped into the edge of the moment, not fast, not loud, just there, like he had always been standing in that spot waiting for the right second to arrive. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't nod, didn't ask permission, he just walked forward with the quiet weight of a man who understood that every step could cost him something, and maybe already had. His boots stopped a few feet from her, close enough to be seen, far enough to stay respectful, and from his side he pulled a worn canteen, leather, cracked from miles and years, and set it down in the dust between them. No words followed, not from him, not from her, just the small sound of metal touching earth and the faint creak of leather settling into stillness. Someone behind him muttered something sharp, another voice joined, warning, mocking, but Ethan didn't turn, didn't answer, he just stepped back once, then again, and walked away as if the act itself meant nothing at all. That was the part that unsettled them, not the water, not the gesture, but the absence of explanation, because out here, every kindness usually came with a reason, a trade, a debt waiting to be collected. Nayeli watched the canteen for a long moment, longer than most would have understood, her hands still at her sides, her breathing slow, controlled, as if even reaching for it might change something she wasn't ready to name. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of leather and dust and something older, something familiar, and finally, when the street had gone quiet enough to hear a single boot scrape from 50 feet away, she bent, lifted the canteen, and held it without drinking. Her fingers tracing the worn edge like it carried a story she almost recognized. Across the street, Ethan stopped without turning back, just long enough to listen, because sometimes the loudest thing in the West wasn't a gun or a shout, it was the silence that came right before everything changed. She did not drink right away, and that was the first thing Ethan noticed without turning his head, because most people in Dry Creek took what they could the moment it appeared. But she held the canteen like it might carry a weight heavier than water, like it asked something in return. The street had shifted, not in sound but in distance, as if the space between people had grown an inch wider, enough to feel, not enough to see. And the men by the well watched her now with a different kind of silence, the kind that comes when something small refuses to behave the way it should. Nayeli finally raised the canteen, but only enough to let the rim touch her lips before she lowered it again, her eyes drifting past the buildings, past the watching faces, settling instead on the open land beyond town where the horizon stretched clean and unclaimed, and for a moment, something softer moved through her expression, gone almost as soon as it came. Ethan reached the hitching post near the saloon, and rested his hand on the worn wood, the grain smooth from years of use, and he stood there longer than necessary, not waiting, not leaving, just present in a way that unsettled anyone paying attention. "You should not have done that," a voice said from behind him, low, careful, the kind of warning that did not need to be repeated, and Ethan did not answer right away, because answers had a way of turning simple things into arguments. And he was not interested in either. People out here notice. The voice continued, they remember who stands where, who chooses sides, and Ethan finally turned his head just enough to acknowledge the words without accepting them, his eyes calm, steady, like a man who had already counted the cost and decided it was not worth mentioning. Across the street, Nayeli stepped away from the well, the canteen still in her hand, and for a second it looked like she might leave it behind, set it back into the dust where it had been placed, but instead she kept it, not as a gift, not as a debt, but as something unresolved, and she walked toward the edge of Town with the same quiet control she had carried into it. A boy near the general store whispered something to his father, pointing not at her, but at the canteen, and the father shook his head slowly, as if trying to place a memory that would not settle, because objects out here did not travel without stories, and that one had just begun its own. Ethan watched her go only when she passed beyond the last building, his gaze following the line of her steps into the open light, and he noticed the way she did not look back, not once, not even out of caution, and that told him more than any words could have. The wind picked up then, light but steady, carrying the faint scent of sage and distant smoke from somewhere beyond the ridge, and it moved through the town like a quiet reminder that nothing in this place ever truly stayed contained. By the time the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the empty road, the story had already begun to shift in the minds of those who witnessed it, not as an act of kindness, but as a question, and questions in the West had a way of traveling farther than answers ever could. Ethan pushed himself off the post and stepped into the fading light, his boots slow, deliberate, because he knew something had been set in motion that could not be called back, not by him, not by anyone, and somewhere beyond the edge of Dry Creek, where the land opened wide and quiet, a woman walked with a canteen that did not belong to her, carrying something she had not yet decided to accept. The night settled over Dry Creek the way it always did, slow and quiet, but something beneath it refused to rest, like the town itself had taken a breath it could not let go of. Lantern light flickered behind dusty windows, voices stayed lower than usual, and more than one man stood a little longer on his porch than he needed to, watching the dark stretch toward the open land where she had disappeared, because out here, people trusted patterns, and today something had broken one. Ethan sat outside the small stable at the edge of town, a tin cup untouched in his hand, his horse shifting behind him, with the soft sound of leather and breath, and he listened to the wind the way some men listen to conversation, not for noise, but for meaning. It carried that same faint scent again, sage and something older, something that did not belong to Dry Creek, and he knew without needing to see that she had not gone far, not yet, miles away from the well but not from the moment itself. Nayeli walked along a narrow stretch of land where the dirt gave way to patches of dry grass, the moon casting just enough light to trace her steps without revealing her path, and she slowed only once, when the canteen at her side brushed against her hand again, reminding her it was still there, still unanswered. She stopped then, not because she was tired, but because the silence around her had changed, and in the distance, far enough to remain unseen but close enough to be felt, figures stood watching, not approaching, not calling out, just present in the way the land sometimes held its own witnesses. She did not turn toward them, not directly, but her voice carried just enough to reach the space between, calm, measured. "I have not accepted it." And the wind seemed to pause around her words, as if even it understood that this was not about water, not anymore. Back in town, a door creaked open and closed again, quick, uncertain, and the man who had spilled the bucket earlier sat at his table with his hands folded, staring at nothing, replaying a moment that had already grown larger than it had any right to be, because what unsettled him was not what the cowboy had done, but what he had refused to do after. No claim, no explanation, no demand for recognition. Ethan finally set the tin cup down beside him and stood, brushing dust from his hands, his movements steady, unhurried, but deliberate in a way that suggested he was following something only he could hear, and he walked past the last building, past the line where the town pretended to end and the land began, stepping into the same quiet that had taken her. Somewhere ahead, the distance held more than darkness, and somewhere behind, the town waited without knowing what it was waiting for. And between those two places, a single act still hung in the air, unfinished, like a question neither side was ready to answer yet. The land opened wider the farther Ethan walked, the last lantern of Dry Creek shrinking behind him until it looked no different from a distant star, and the silence out here was not empty, it was layered, filled with things that did not need to be seen to be understood. His boots pressed into the dry ground with a steady rhythm, each step measured, not cautious, not careless, just certain. As if he had walked this same path before without knowing it. Ahead, the faint outline of a figure stood, against a pale stretch of moonlit earth, still as a post, yet somehow alive in the way only someone fully aware could be, and he slowed before reaching her, stopping at a distance that carried respect without fear. Nayeli did not turn right away, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if it held an answer she had been waiting on long before this day began. And when she finally spoke, her voice did not rise or fall, it simply existed. "You followed." And the words carried no accusation, only recognition. Ethan shook his head slightly, though she had not looked. "No," he said. "I walked." And the space between them held that answer for a moment, stretching it, testing it, before letting it settle. The canteen hung at her side, untouched still, and the leather strap had left a faint mark against her hand where her fingers had tightened and loosened more than once, a quiet battle no one else had witnessed. "Out here," she said after a while, "things are not given without meaning." And she finally turned, her eyes meeting his with a steadiness that did not ask for explanation but demanded truth. Ethan did not step closer, did not fill the space, he only nodded once, then. "Do not take it as a gift," he replied, his voice low, even. "Take it as something that was owed long before today." And that was the first time something shifted in her expression, not softness, not yet, but a pause, a break in the line she had been holding. The wind moved between them again, lifting a strand of her dark hair, carrying that same scent of sage and distance, and from the ridge beyond, the unseen presence remained quiet, patient, not interfering, only witnessing the exchange unfold in its own time. Nayeli lifted the canteen slowly, turning it in her hands, her fingers tracing the worn edge again, but this time with purpose, as if she were reading something written there, something older than either of them, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a quieter weight. "You speak like someone who remembers a story that is not his." And Ethan's eyes held hers without hesitation. "Maybe it is not mine," he said, "but it found its way to me anyway." And the words did not push forward, did not demand belief, they simply rested there, waiting. The night deepened around them, but neither moved, because some moments in the West did not belong to time, they belonged to choice. And somewhere between the distance they kept and the truth they did not fully speak, something fragile had begun to form, not trust, not yet, but the space where trust might one day stand, if either of them chose to turn away. The wind shifted again, softer now, like it had decided to listen instead of move, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because some truths did not arrive through questions, they arrived when silence had done enough work. Nayeli lowered her eyes to the canteen, turning it once more in her hands, but this time she did not hesitate, she opened it slowly. The faint sound of metal brushing leather carrying farther than it should have in the still night, and she drank, not deeply, not like someone desperate, but like someone choosing something carefully, and when she closed it again, the gesture felt different, quieter, settled. Ethan watched without stepping forward, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture unchanged, because whatever this was, it was not something he could move closer to without breaking it. "If it was owed," Nayeli said, her voice steady but no longer distant, "then it was not to me." And she lifted her gaze back to him, searching, not for weakness, but for something that would hold under weight. Ethan took a slow breath, the kind that carried memory with it whether he wanted it or not, and he reached into his coat, not quickly, not hidden, drawing out something small wrapped in cloth worn thin at the edges, and he held it in his palm without offering it yet. "My mother used to say," he began, his voice quieter now, "that the West keeps its own ledger, not written in ink, but in moments people forget to notice." And he unfolded the cloth just enough to reveal a dull silver pendant, its surface marked with age, a symbol carved into it that caught what little light the moon offered. Nayeli did not move at first, but something in her shoulders shifted, something older than the night between them, and she stepped one pace closer, just enough to see it clearly without crossing the distance entirely. Her breath changed, not louder, but different, as if it had found something it recognized before her mind allowed it, and her fingers tightened slightly around the canteen. "That mark," she said, almost to herself. "It belongs to someone who healed without asking who deserved it." And the words carried a weight that did not belong to Dry Creek, did not belong to this moment alone. Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady on the pendant rather than on her. "She told me it was given to her by a woman who found her when no one else would," he said. "Someone who did not speak much, but stayed." And the last word lingered, not emphasized, not explained, just there, like something he had learned to hold on to without understanding it fully. Nayeli stepped closer again, this time not stopping halfway, and the space between them narrowed just enough to feel shared, her eyes fixed on the symbol, her voice quieter now. "My grandmother wore one like this," she said. "She said it was not a sign of who you were, but of what you chose to carry." And for the first time, something in her expression softened, not into trust, not yet, but into recognition, the kind that does not ask permission before it arrives. The ridge behind her remained still, the unseen watchers unmoving, but the air around them had changed, as if the distance between two worlds had shifted by an inch, small enough to miss, large enough to matter, and Ethan closed his hand around the pendant again, not hiding it, just holding it, because some things were not meant to be given away, only understood. Nayeli looked at him then, fully this time, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as something else she had not yet named, and the canteen at her side no longer felt like an unanswered question, it felt like the beginning of one. The space between them did not close any further, but it no longer felt divided, and that was the kind of change that did not announce itself, it simply settled in like dust after a long ride. Nayeli lowered her gaze from the pendant, not in retreat, but in thought, as if something inside her had begun to shift direction, slow and deliberate, and when she spoke again, her voice carried less distance than before. "My grandmother said the same thing," she said, "that some people arrive not to take, but to remind," and the word remind lingered between them like something unfinished. Ethan did not answer right away, because he understood that words, once placed here, did not disappear easily, and he chose them the way a man chooses where to step in uncertain ground. "She never told me who she helped," he said finally, his eyes steady. "Only that it was enough to keep going." And he paused, not for effect, but because memory had a way of arriving in pieces. "She said the woman wore strength like it was quiet, not loud." And that was when Nayeli's breath shifted again, almost unnoticeable, but different enough to matter. She looked past him for a moment, toward the faint outline of the ridge where the unseen presence still waited, and her voice lowered. "She did not stay long after that winter," she said, "but she spoke of a girl who would grow up between worlds." And now her eyes returned to him, sharper, clearer. "A girl who would have to choose what to carry when both sides turned away." And the words did not accuse, did not demand, they simply revealed. Ethan's hand tightened slightly around the pendant, not from tension, but from recognition. The kind that comes when two separate paths suddenly show the same mark, and he nodded once, slowly. "Then maybe she was not just talking about you," he said, and the air between them held that thought without rushing it. The wind moved again, this time warmer, carrying with it the faint rustle of grass bending somewhere beyond sight, and from the ridge, one of the distant figures shifted, just enough to signal awareness without intrusion, a silent acknowledgement that this moment had crossed from chance into meaning. Nayeli took one step back, not away from him, but into her own space again, reclaiming it, and she lifted the canteen once more, studying it briefly before securing it at her side, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning its place there. "You speak of things that do not belong to your people," she said, but there was no edge in her tone now, only observation, and Ethan met her gaze without defense. "Maybe they do not belong to anyone," he replied. "Maybe they just find who will carry them." And the simplicity of it did not weaken the truth, it made it harder to deny. For a moment, either moved, and the night seemed to hold its breath around them, because something had been placed between them that could not be taken back, not the water, not the pendant, but the understanding that followed, quiet and unclaimed. Nayeli turned then, not abruptly, not to leave him behind, but to face the open land again. And her voice came one last time over her shoulder. Softer now, but certain. "The morning will not be quiet," she said, and Ethan did not ask what she meant, because he already knew that whatever came with the sunrise would not be carried by words, and as she walked forward into the pale stretch of night, the distance between them returned, but it no longer felt like separation, it felt like something waiting to be crossed when the time decided it was ready. The first light of morning did not arrive gently, it stretched across the land like something deliberate, revealing shapes that had always been there but were never meant to be seen all at once, and Ethan was already standing at the edge of Dry Creek when it came, his silhouette still against the pale horizon, his eyes fixed on the open stretch beyond. Where the night had ended without answers, behind him, the town stirred slower than usual, doors opening with hesitation, boots touching ground with less certainty, because something in the air had changed overnight, and even those who could not name it felt it settling into their bones. The well stood quiet, the bucket untouched, as if the memory of yesterday had left a mark that no one wanted to disturb, and one by one, people stepped outside, not speaking, not gathering, just watching, drawn by something they did not understand but could not ignore. Far beyond the last building, where the land widened and the dust gave way to open earth, figures began to appear, not rushing, not hidden, simply there, emerging from the morning light like part of the land itself, and they did not carry urgency, they carried presence, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be felt. Ethan did not move toward them. Did not step back either, he remained where he was, because he understood that this was not something to meet halfway, it was something to witness fully. The first of them stopped at a distance that mirrored the space he had kept the night before, respectful, measured, and behind him, more figures took their place, not in formation, not in display, but in quiet alignment, each one still, each one aware. The town had gone completely silent now, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears, heavy with expectation, and somewhere behind Ethan, a door creaked again, followed by the faint shuffle of someone stepping closer then stopping, unsure of where they belonged in this moment. Nayeli stood among them, not at the front, not hidden, simply present, her posture steady, her gaze directed not at the town, but at Ethan, and there was no hesitation in her eyes now, only clarity, the kind that comes after a choice has already been made. Ethan felt it before he saw it, that shift, that quiet confirmation, and his hand moved briefly to the inside of his coat. Not to draw the pendant, but to acknowledge its weight, as if it had found its place not in his hand, but in what had led him here. One of the elders stepped forward then, an older man whose presence carried the kind of authority that did not need to be spoken, and he looked not at the crowd, not at the buildings, but at Ethan alone, studying him in a way that felt neither judgment nor approval, just understanding. No words were exchanged, not at first, because this was not a moment built for speech, it was built for recognition, and in that stillness, something passed between them that no one else could fully see, a quiet agreement that had been written long before this morning had arrived. Behind Ethan, the town remained frozen, caught between what they had believed and what now stood in front of them, and for the first time, the line they had drawn so easily felt uncertain, like something that might not hold if tested. The elder inclined his head slightly, not a bow, not submission, but acknowledgement, and then stepped back, returning to his place without breaking the silence. Nayeli held Ethan's gaze for one breath longer, just enough to say what words would have made smaller, and then she turned. Not away from him, but toward her people. Her movement calm, assured, as if the path ahead no longer needed to be questioned. The figures began to recede as quietly as they had come, not leaving in retreat, but in completion, and as the distance between them and the town grew, the weight in the air began to lift, replaced by something else, something unfamiliar but lighter. Ethan remained where he was until the last figure disappeared beyond the ridge. And only then did he turn back toward Dry Creek, where the people now stood watching him with eyes that no longer held the same certainty they had the day before, because sometimes, in the West, nothing needed to be said for everything to change. The town did not return to normal, not that morning, not in the way it once understood the word, because something had shifted that could not be pushed back into place, and even the smallest sounds carried differently now, as if they had to pass through something heavier before reaching the ear. Ethan walked past the well without stopping, though he felt every pair of eyes follow him, not with anger, not even with suspicion anymore, but with something quieter, something closer to uncertainty. And that was harder to face than any open judgment. The man who had spilled the water the day before stood near the edge of the street, his hands at his sides, his posture smaller than before, and when Ethan passed him, there was a moment, brief but clear, where words almost formed, but did not, and that silence said more than anything spoken could have. The sun climbed higher, warming the dust, stretching shadows into shapes that no longer looked the same, and people began to move again, slowly at first, then with a cautious rhythm. Like they were testing whether the ground beneath them still held. Near the stable, Ethan paused, resting his hand against the wooden post again, the same place he had stood the day before, but it did not feel like the same spot, because now it carried memory, and memory had a way of changing the shape of things. He reached into his coat and took out the pendant once more, turning it in his fingers, the worn edges catching the light, and for the first time, he did not see it as something from the past, but as something that had already done its work. Across the street, a young boy approached the well, hesitating only a second before lowering the bucket, his small hands steady despite the weight, and when he lifted it, he did not look around for approval, he simply carried it to the trough and poured, the water spilling cleanly, without hesitation, without performance. Ethan watched that small act with the same stillness he had held the night before. Because he understood that change in the West did not arrive in declarations, it arrived in moments like that, quiet, almost unnoticeable unless you were paying attention. The wind moved through Dry Creek again, lighter now, carrying less tension, more space, and somewhere beyond the ridge, where the figures had disappeared, the land remained open, unchanged in its distance, but different in what it now held. Ethan slipped the pendant back into his coat, not because he needed to keep it hidden, but because it no longer needed to be seen. And he turned toward the open land once more, his gaze steady, not searching, not waiting, just aware, because out here, some things did not return, they moved forward, and what had passed through Dry Creek that morning had not been a warning, not a threat, but something far quieter, something the town would carry long after the dust settled, whether they chose to understand it or not. By late afternoon, Dry Creek looked the same from a distance, but up close, nothing quite fit the way it had before, like a picture that had been shifted by an inch and could not be pushed back into place. The well stood where it always had, the saloon doors still creaked in the same tired rhythm, and the dust still carried the same dry scent, but the people moved differently now, slower in their certainty, quieter in their judgment. As if something unseen had asked them to reconsider what they thought they understood. Ethan finished his work without drawing attention, repairing a loose rail along the stable, checking the tack, moving through his routine with the same steady patience that had carried him through years no one in town had bothered to ask about, and when he stepped back to look at the line he had fixed, he did not measure it for perfection, only for whether it would hold. Across the street, the man who had once spilled the water approached the well again, this time alone. His movements deliberate, almost careful, and when he lowered the bucket, he did not rush, he did not look around, he simply waited until it filled, then lifted it with both hands and set it gently in place, leaving it there, not claiming it, not guarding it, just allowing it to be taken. A few others noticed, not with surprise, but with something closer to understanding, and no one spoke. Because whatever needed to be said had already passed through them that morning. The sun dipped lower, casting long lines of light across the ground, and at the edge of town, where the land opened wide again, a single figure appeared for a moment, distant enough to be mistaken for shadow, but still enough to be known, and Ethan saw it without turning his head, the way a man notices something familiar without needing to confirm it. Nayeli did not step closer, did not cross into the town, she only stood there, her posture calm, her presence unchanged, and though the distance between them remained, it no longer felt like separation, it felt like something chosen, something respected. Ethan rested his hand once more against the wooden post, the same place, the same gesture, but now it carried a different weight, not of waiting, not of expectation, but of acknowledgement, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to look directly toward her, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. The wind moved between them, carrying no tension now, only space, and she inclined her head slightly, the smallest movement, easy to miss, but impossible to misunderstand, and then she turned, walking back toward the open land without hesitation, her figure blending into the distance until it became part of the horizon again. Ethan did not follow, did not call out. Because some endings in the West were not meant to be held on to, they were meant to be understood and left where they belonged, and as he turned back toward Dry Creek, the town no longer felt like something separate from what had happened, it felt like something that had been changed by it. The well remained full, the water clear, untouched for a moment longer before someone stepped forward to draw from it, not with hesitation this time, but with quiet acceptance, and as the first drop spilled into waiting hands, it did not feel like charity, it did not feel like debt, it felt like something simpler, something older, something that had finally found its way back into a place that had almost forgotten it. Out here, justice did not arrive with noise or force, it settled in slowly, carried by those willing to stand still long enough to let it pass through them, and sometimes, all it took was one man who chose not to turn away.